I built my whole life on two things: trust and hard work. For 35 years, I ran my logistics company from the ground up, side by side with my business partner, Keith, and supported by my wife, Lorraine, who believed in every late night and missed holiday. At least, that's what I thought. When you reach 62, you think betrayal can't surprise you anymore. But I learned the hardest lesson too late. Sometimes the knife doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from the people who smile beside you while sharpening it. I lost everything in 1 week: my marriage, my business, and what I thought was my purpose. But what I found afterward was something no amount of money or revenge could ever buy. This isn't a story about getting even. It's about learning to let go and walking away richer than before. When I think back on it now, I can still smell the diesel on my hands and hear the hum of that old Ford pickup. That truck wasn't just metal and wheels to me. It was the beginning of everything. I was 24 when I bought it, paid in cash after working years in warehouses and sleeping short nights. I didn't have much: no college degree, no rich uncle. But I had two things that carried me further than most folks ever expected: grit and faith. I believed that if I kept showing up, no matter how rough it got, something good had to come of it. By the time I turned 62, that one truck had turned into a whole line of them. A small fleet, we called it. The kind of thing that made people stop and say, "You built all this?" I'd smile and nod, but deep down I knew it wasn't just me. It was years of sacrifice, early mornings, late nights, and a handful of good people who believed in what we were doing. None more than my best friend, Keith. Keith and I met when we were just teenagers in Houston. He was the kind of guy who could make anyone laugh, even in the middle of a storm. I was quieter, the planner, the one always thinking 3 steps ahead. Together, we made a good team. He knew how to talk to people, how to bring in business, and I knew how to keep it running smoothly. We didn't even have contracts in those early years, just handshakes and hard work. He became like a brother to me, someone I trusted with my life and my dreams. And then there was Lorraine, my wife, my anchor. She kept the books, balanced the numbers, and kept the coffee pot full. She used to sit by the window with her glasses low on her nose, tapping her pencil against that old calculator. I used to joke that she ran the company just as much as I did. She'd laugh and say, "Well, someone's got to keep you two dreamers out of trouble." Back then, she was the glue that held everything together: the business, the home, and me. We didn't have much time for fancy vacations or dinners. Most nights, I'd come home long after the sun went down. The smell of grease and asphalt would follow me through the door. Lorraine would already be in bed, sometimes reading, sometimes pretending to be asleep. I'd wash my hands, sit at the edge of the bed, and she'd turn to me with a small smile. "You're working too hard," she'd say. I'd always give her the same answer: "I'm doing it for us." And for a while, that was enough. The business started growing faster than I could have imagined. We hired more drivers, got a proper office, and even landed a few city contracts. There were days I felt on top of the world, my name on the side of every truck, my phone ringing with new deals, and people looking at me with the kind of respect I'd never had before. It felt good, maybe too good, because somewhere in all that noise, I started losing sight of the quiet things that really mattered. Lorraine began spending more time at home alone. I could feel it, even if she didn't say it. She'd ask if I was coming home for dinner, and I'd tell her I had one more meeting, one more stop to make. I'd get home to find the plates wrapped up in foil, the food cold but waiting. She left a note sometimes, just a few words like "Don't forget to rest," or "Love you, be safe." I kept those notes for years. Keith, on the other hand, became my shadow. We traveled together, met clients together, spent long nights in the office. He was the one who saw the company as more than a small business. He had ideas, big ones. "Henry," he'd say, "we could double this thing in 2 years if we just push harder." And he was right. But every time I pushed harder, something at home seemed to pull away. I remember one evening clear as day. We were celebrating a new contract, a big one. I invited a few of the team over, and Lorraine cooked like she used to, made her famous roast. Everyone laughed, clapped me on the back, and toasted to our success. But when I looked across the table, Lorraine's smile didn't reach her eyes. She looked tired, not just from the day, but from the years of waiting. Keith sat beside her, telling one of his stories, and she laughed softly. It was the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in a long time. I told myself I was imagining things. I brushed it off the way men do when they don't want to face what's right in front of them. I told myself, she's just happy we're doing well. Don't overthink it. But something about the way her hand lingered on his arm for a second too long, just enough for me to notice, stuck with me. After everyone left, I stood in the kitchen, cleaning up plates while Lorraine put away leftovers. I wanted to ask her if she was happy, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I said, "We're really growing, huh?" She nodded, not looking at me. "Yeah," she said softly. "You are." I should have asked her what she meant by that. But instead, I just wiped the counter, kissed her on the cheek, and went to bed thinking about tomorrow's schedule. The next few years moved fast. Contracts, clients, growth. I spent more time behind a desk than behind a steering wheel. The company had a rhythm, and I had a reputation. But the house got quieter. Lorraine stopped asking when I'd be home. We stopped eating together. We'd pass each other in the hallway like neighbors, polite and distant. Keith started spending more time around the house, helping with paperwork or stopping by when I wasn't there. I didn't think much of it. I trusted him completely. He was family. Lorraine even said once, "It's nice to have someone around when you're always gone." I smiled, thinking she meant it kindly. I didn't see the loneliness under her words. Looking back now, I can see the cracks forming, the moments I missed, the silences I ignored. I thought success would hold everything together. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I gave her the life she deserved, that would be enough. But sometimes, people don't want a life you build for them. They just want you to be in it. There was a night, late summer, when I came home from a business trip. The house was dark, except for a single lamp by the couch. Lorraine was sitting there, staring out the window, her face unreadable. "You didn't call," she said quietly. I told her I'd been busy, that things had run late. She nodded. "They always do." That's all she said. We sat there in silence for a long time, the kind that fills a room and settles heavy on your chest. I wanted to say something to fix it, to reach her, but after years of letting that distance grow, I didn't even know where to start. Keith called the next morning, talking about a new client, new opportunities. I said yes before thinking, eager to drown out the unease at home with work. It was easier to keep moving forward than to stop and face what was already slipping away. The success that once brought us together was quietly pulling us apart. Lorraine's eyes no longer followed me when I walked in the room. The laughter that once echoed through our house was gone, replaced by the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock that seemed louder every night. Sometimes, when I'd walk past her study and see her sitting there, staring at old photos of us in the early days, I'd feel this ache in my chest, like watching something precious fade and being powerless to stop it. But I told myself, this is just how marriage gets after so many years. People grow apart. It's normal. I didn't know it then, but I was standing in the quiet before the storm, the kind that doesn't come with thunder or rain, just a slow, steady unraveling of everything you thought was unbreakable. And that's how it began. The success I thought would secure our future became the wedge that drove us apart. What I didn't realize then was that the people I trusted most were already standing on the other side of that crack, watching it widen, waiting for the moment it would finally split all the way through. It's strange how distance doesn't always happen in miles. Sometimes it starts right there across the same dinner table. You can still see the person, still hear their voice, but something in between grows, quietly, like fog rolling in. That's how it was with Lorraine and me. I could feel her slipping away, not all at once, but little by little, in ways that were easy to miss if you didn't want to see them. Her laughter was the first thing that changed. Lorraine used to laugh with her whole heart. It wasn't just sound, it was light. But now, it came softer, shorter, like she was holding something back. I'd say something funny, something I knew used to make her smile, and she'd grin politely, nod, and then go right back to folding laundry or staring at the TV. I told myself it was just the years. People mellow out, That's all. But deep down, I knew better. We were living in the same house, but not really together anymore. We moved around each other like ghosts. I'd wake up early to get to the yard before sunrise, and by the time I came home, she'd already gone to bed. Our words turned into updates instead of conversations. Dinner's in the fridge. You left your jacket in the truck. The accountant called. Every now and then, she'd look at me like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I could feel her slipping, and I did what I always do when something scares me. I buried myself in work. I told myself, if I can just keep the business growing, if I can make things better for us, maybe she'll see I'm doing this for her. But working harder didn't fix anything. It just gave me less time to notice what was already broken. Keith started coming around more. At first, I didn't think much of it. He'd always been like family. He knew Lorraine as long as I had. Sometimes, he'd stop by the house when I was still at the office. He'd say he was dropping off invoices or checking on some paperwork. Lorraine would tell me later, Keith stopped in to help me sort out the receipts. She'd say it so casually that I didn't think twice. Looking back now, I wonder if I wanted not to think twice. It's easier to believe everything's fine than to admit the people closest to you might be drifting into places they shouldn't. Keith had this charm about him. Easygoing, funny, the kind of man who made people feel seen. He had a way of talking that made you forget time. And Lorraine, she always liked that about him. I did too, once. I used to say Keith could sell water to a fish. I remember one afternoon, I came home early from a client meeting. The house was quiet except for a low hum from the kitchen. I walked in and saw Lorraine and Keith sitting at the table, close, their heads bent over some paperwork. She was laughing, really laughing, the way she used to. When they noticed me, they both straightened up quickly. Lorraine smiled and said, "Oh, we were just talking about next quarter's budget." I nodded, tried to smile back, but there was a tightness in my chest that I couldn't shake. After Keith left, I asked, "He's been around a lot lately, hasn't he?" She gave me this look, half defensive, half tired. "He's helping, Henry. You're gone so much. Someone has to make sure the books are in order." I wanted to say, "That used to be you and me," but the words never came out. Instead, I just nodded and said, "Yeah, I appreciate it." That's the thing about silence. It can feel polite at first, even peaceful, but over time, it becomes a wall. Every word you don't say stacks another brick. Before you know it, you're on one side and they're on the other, and neither of you remembers how to reach across. The business kept growing, but my home started shrinking. Lorraine stopped coming to company events. She said she didn't feel up to it. When clients came to dinner, she'd stay in the kitchen, quiet and polite, no longer the woman who used to sit beside me, laughing at stories and sharing the pride of what we built together. Even Keith started changing around me. He used to talk to me about everything, plans, contracts, the next big idea. But now he'd keep things to himself. I'd walk into a meeting, and the two of them would already be there, whispering, paper spread across the table. When I'd ask what was going on, he'd say, "Just going over some numbers." I told myself it was fine. That's what trust is, right? Letting people handle things without checking over their shoulder. But trust only works when everyone's still on the same side. One night, I came home late from a delivery run. The house was dark, except for the soft glow from the kitchen window. Lorraine was on the phone, her voice low, gentle. I didn't want to startle her, so I stopped by the doorway. She didn't see me. I heard her say, "No, don't worry about it. He'll be gone most of tomorrow." That one sentence hit me harder than I expected. It could have meant anything. Maybe it was about business. Maybe not. But in that moment, all I could think was, who's she talking about me like that? When she hung up, I stepped into the kitchen. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She turned surprised. "Oh, just Keith. We were going over tomorrow's invoices." "Keith. Always Keith." I nodded, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down. She looked at me for a moment, like she wanted to say more, then just walked out. I sat there for a long time after she went upstairs, listening to the house creak in the quiet. It's strange how loneliness can live inside a home full of memories. Every photo on the wall, every plate in the cabinet, every little thing becomes a reminder of what used to be, not what is. The next few months went on like that, routine, polite, distant. Keith and I still worked side by side, but something between us fell off. He'd make decisions without telling me, start meetings without me. The drivers began going to him for approvals instead of coming to me. I brushed it off as him taking initiative, but in truth, I could feel my grip on the business loosening just like my hold on my marriage. One afternoon, I walked into the office early. Keith and Lorraine were in the conference room, talking in low voices. The blinds were half drawn, light cutting across the table in thin lines. I stood there for a second, watching through the glass. They weren't touching, not doing anything you could call wrong, but there was a closeness between them that didn't need words. When they saw me, they both straightened. Keith smiled too quickly. "Hey, Henry, didn't expect you this early." Lorraine busied herself with her purse. We were just finishing up. That's when I felt it, the kind of chill that comes not from doubt, but from knowing. I didn't say anything, just walked to my office, shut the door, and sat there staring at the wall. I spent the rest of that day pretending everything was fine, smiled through meetings, signed papers, gave orders, but inside, something in me started to go quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm when the air feels heavy and still. I tried one more time that week to reach her. We were sitting at the kitchen table, dinner between us. She was scrolling through her phone. I said softly, "You remember when we first started the business? You used to come with me on every route. I used to call you my good luck charm." She smiled faintly, not looking up. "That was a long time ago, Henry." "Yeah," I said. "Feels like another lifetime." She finally looked up then, her eyes tired but kind. "You've built something amazing. You should be proud." I wanted to tell her it didn't mean much without her beside me, but before I could, her phone buzzed. She checked it quickly, said, "I need to take this," and walked out of the room. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sound of her voice through the wall, low and distant, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd become a stranger in my own life. I thought about all the times I told myself that providing was enough, that a man's job was to build, to protect, to give. But I'd forgotten that sometimes the people you're given don't want more. They just want you. And the more I worked to hold everything together, the more it all seemed to slip right through my fingers. I didn't know it yet, but the distance that had started between us wasn't just emotional anymore. It was becoming something else, something deeper, something dangerous. It was turning into betrayal. I never believed in sudden betrayals. I always thought something was going to go wrong. You'd see the first cracks, a missed dinner, a curt word, a door left open. Trouble, I figured, arrives like weather. You feel the humidity, you smell the rain before it falls. Still, nothing prepared me for quietness of that night. The way the world around me shrank down to a single rectangle of frosted glass, and the sight beyond it. I had gone back to the office for a file. It was a kind of small chore that should have taken 5 minutes. I remember flipping on the lights, the way the fluorescent hum felt oddly loud in the empty building. The driver's boots were gone, lunch boxes stacked in lockers. It was late, later than I usually stayed. I remember thinking how foolish it was to be working through the evening, when the house at home was empty and the porch light was off. Still, the ledger was missing, and my handwriting felt more honest than any memory I could trust. So I went looking for it. The conference room at the back has a frosted glass wall, the kind that keeps meetings private, but lets light leak through like an old secret. I walked toward it because the file was where we kept delivery contracts, the paperwork Keith and I used to argue over while Lorraine sat across the table, correcting our sums and laughing at our stubbornness. I pushed the door open with a hand that didn't tremble, and then I saw them. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a hand on a shoulder, the kind of touch married couples and lifelong friends used to say, "I'm with you." But then Lorraine turned, and the look between them was soft in a way that had nothing to do with partnership or shared work. Keith leaned in and kissed her, a small, quick kiss, but the kind that belongs behind closed doors, not under the office lights. The sound of the kiss was swallowed by the air conditioning, Only my own breath filled the hallway. For a second, nothing moved. Then everything did. I backed away without meaning to. My shoes clicked on the tile. The sound seemed too loud. I stood in the hallway where the shadow of the frosted glass cut me off from them, and I felt my chest go strangely light, like a room emptied all at once. I did not yell. I did not burst into that room, demanding the answer to 1,000 questions. I remember thinking, with a clarity I did not like, that there was nothing to say that would make any of it better. On the drive home, the streetlights slid by in a kind of slow, indifferent procession. I kept my hands at 10 and 2, my knuckles white around the wheel. I drove like a man who was learning how to hold himself steady again. The city looked the same neon at the corner store, the same late truck idling by the diner. But inside me, the map had redrawn itself. Roads I walked on every day now seemed to lead somewhere else entirely. I thought about all the little moments I'd misread as ordinary. I thought about the nights I'd chosen a board meeting over a bedside conversation. I thought about the times I'd told myself that what I did was for them, not against them. The truth came then. What I had been building for my family might have been building something else in them. Distance, secrets, a life that did not include me. That night I sat on the back step of our old house, where the lilac bushes still remembered Lorraine's hands, and I watched the dark. There's a way the night gathers itself when you let it, like a person folding in on their anger until it becomes something private. I didn't cry. I had never been a man who found his voice in tears. I felt a different kind of closing, a hinge shutting slowly. It was quieter than anger, sharper than surprise. It was the moment a man understands that his world has shifted without his consent, and there is nothing he can do to push it back into the place it occupied a moment ago. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the early mornings hauling freight, the evenings balancing the books with a steady hand, Lorraine's laugh cutting the tension at the end of a long day. I thought about the nights our son was small, and Lorraine would braid his hair and whisper things about hope and stubbornness that made me laugh because I'd never known anyone so sure of life's small mercies. I thought about Keith, how he'd come into our lives like another brother, an easy smile and steady work ethic. I thought about how trust had been effortless once, the way we passed keys without question, how decisions were shared over coffee. None of those memories felt false. They were real. But now, wedged between those memories, was a new, colder image that altered everything around it. Inside the house, Lorraine's perfume still lingered on a lampshade, that familiar mix of cedar and citrus she always favored. The photograph on the mantel, our son in his cap and gown, Lorraine leaning into me with that ridiculous proud grin, looked smaller than it used to. I caught myself reaching for explanations. Maybe it was a mistake, a moment of loneliness. I thought. My mind offered all the mercies I could imagine. Maybe Keith had been there for her in a way I hadn't noticed. Maybe our marriage had frayed in places I thought held. But explanations felt like a thin blanket over a cold room, comforting in the short term, useless in the long. When Lorraine came home that night, she moved like someone returning from a long errand, shoulders pulled in with the day's fatigue. She did not look at me as if she had been holding something back. She poured herself a glass of water and asked, as one might after a normal day, whether I'd eaten. I remember answering that I had, that I'd been late. I watched her face for a sign, a shadow of guilt, perhaps, or the worry I expected. But there was nothing like the devastation I carried. She spoke of small things, a bill to be paid, a neighbor's cat that wouldn't come down from the fence. She made tea. Her hands moved with familiar rhythm. It was the mundane creature comfort of ordinary domestic life, and it made my chest ache in a way I had not anticipated. How could the world go on with such normalcy while a part of my life had been rearranged in a single private motion? I didn't confront her. That would make for a noisy scene, the kind that fills rooms with raised voices and dangling accusations. I have no taste for spectacle. Besides, I had learned that when you make a man choose between anger and dignity, the quiet one wins by default. So instead, I made the decision to sit with the truth. I let it exist in me like a stone, heavy and small. I pressed it into my palm and turned it over until I knew its edges. All that night, I lay awake and cataloged the small things that showed me the edges first. The way Lorraine had stopped answering the phone when I was home. The way Keith had begun offering to take care of weekend paperwork. The way invitations that used to be whispered plans had become meetings in the office. Each one had seemed harmless, polite, reasonable until they were not. Betrayal doesn't always arrive as an explosion. Sometimes it arrives as a rearrangement, a reallocation of loyalties and affections. And often you're the last to be told. I thought of the men I'd learned from. My father, the old foreman who took me under his wing when I was 20, and nobody would give a mechanic a second look. They taught me how to fix engines, how to read a truck's groan, and answer it before it failed. They taught me how to keep my word, and how to hold my temper. They taught me how to walk away when something wasn't worth the fight. That night, I remembered them not because I wanted to be like them, but because I needed a scaffold for myself. I needed the quiet courage men rarely discuss. The courage to preserve oneself when the world has been unkind. In the morning, the house smelled like coffee and old wood. I made my way through the routine as if through fog, checking the trucks, signing paperwork, giving orders. My voice sounded normal on the radio, steady and professional. The men who worked for me greeted me with the ordinary respect we had shared for years. They didn't know the small, private things that had shifted in the rooms I inhabited. Why would they? A man's life is a collection of public duties and private weather, and the public parts had to continue. I found an odd solace in that. There is something to be said for dignity in the mundane, for showing up and doing your work even when your heart is bruised. It is a kind of revenge, too, I realize, not the sharp strike of vindictiveness, but the slow reclaiming of self through steady action. I walked into the office and saw Keith's car in the lot. He smiled when he spotted me, that same easy grin. He came over and clapped me on the shoulder with a familiarity I no longer wanted to accept. I returned the gesture with a practiced nod and went straight to my desk. There's a place where the human impulse to lash out meets the need to preserve what little remains of your life unscathed. I chose the latter. Some fights are worth losing if they teach you what you truly value. That day, I signed contracts and answered calls. I delegated tasks like I always had, but each decision felt newly mine, unclouded by assumption. When the sun dipped low and the trucks rolled in, I stood by the loading bay and watched them return like a congregation of familiar rhythms. I measured the quiet in breaths and found it steady. Something inside me had closed, yes, a chapter, an expectation, a small, private trust. But what closed also made space for something else. I could feel it, faint at first, an emptiness that might one day be filled with a different purpose, a life shaped by my own hands rather than the hands of others. That night, in the dark when the house finally belonged only to me, I did not demand answers. I did not rage. I put on the kettle, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote things down, not plans of vengeance, but a list of small acts I could do for myself. Take the boat out at dawn, visit the old cafe down by the river again, fix the rusted bench on the front stoop. These were small things. They were not the roaring justice of novels and late-night television. They were practical, domestic, patient. They were mine. When I turned off the lamp and climbed into bed, I felt the shape of the house differently. The room still held our memories, and some of them would always hum with what had been. But now there was a new kind of stillness, not resignation but readiness. I understood, in a way that no other moment had taught me, that the life I wanted going forward would be built from the same materials I used to construct my business. Steady work, honest hands, and the quiet resilience to begin again. The hurt was real, and it would take time to heal. But the thing that had closed inside me that night was not a coffin. It was a door, and on the other side, somewhere in the future, something had the chance to grow. The morning after I saw them through the frosted glass, I did the last thing anyone would have expected. I did not storm through the office doors. I did not shout, fling accusations, or demand an explanation. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened the ledger the way a man opens a book he's read 1,000 times, but is suddenly looking at with new eyes. You learn a lot about people from numbers. They don't lie the way a face can. They don't pretend. For 35 years, I'd watched the company grow line by line. Receipts stacked like the history of us, invoices that read like a trail of seasons. That morning, I spread the papers across the table and started at the beginning, the way I used it when a truck's engine ran rough. Slowly, systematically, listen and look, and then move the next part. I looked for patterns. I looked for what didn't belong. At first, the books looked the same. Loads moved, invoices paid, fuel accounted for. But when you stop assuming good faith and start checking for truth, small things pop up. A vendor we'd never used before on a Tuesday in March. A consulting fee with no signature. Wire transfers routed through accounts with names that sounded foreign to a man who lives his life in Texas. It wasn't one thing. It was many small things, like hairline cracks that quietly turn into a fault. I called Marcus, my lawyer, and told him to come by. Marcus has been a friend more than a lawyer for years. The kind of man who kept his sleeves rolled and his conscience close to his collar. He arrived in a suit that knew how to sit without shouting. I poured more coffee and told him what I'd found. He didn't gasp. He took his glasses off, set them down, and said, "We'll need copies. We'll need the bank statements. And keep this between us for now." He said it like a man who'd seen this before and knew how much quieter the work of undoing a wrong has to be. We began to peel it back carefully. Some of it was petty, almost bureaucratic, a line item in a maintenance account that was conveniently overblown every quarter. Some of it was brazen, a shell company set up in a neighbor state, invoices for logistics consultancy that matched no services we ever received, and signatures that had been forged with a light, practiced hand. There were transfers to an account in Keith's name. There were reimbursements to Lorraine's credit card for hotel rooms with dates that matched late-night meetings. It wasn't just a kiss in the conference room. The betrayal had been penciled into the margins for months. There's a strange clarity that comes when you see the proof. Hurt is cleaner. You can measure it. I could have called them both that afternoon and thrown the ledger across the table. I could have demanded men and women in stern suits and cameras and a public unraveling. But that's not the life I built. I never wanted my family's trouble to be someone else's entertainment. Besides, what good would spectacle do? Money would be spent on lawyers. Names could be rearranged. In the end, the thing I needed most was to know where I stood so I could stand somewhere else. So I moved quietly. The first step was to protect the company from further emptying. Marcus advised me to change certain authorizations, to redirect sensitive signatory powers, to ask the bank to flag unusual transfers. I felt like a man patching a ship while still on it. The drivers didn't notice. The dispatchers did their jobs. The shipments left and arrived. My presence in the yard was the same as before. A nod, a wave, the same little jokes about weather and fuel. It felt, in a way, like the strongest kind of defiance to keep the ordinary functioning while you dismantle the extraordinary betrayal behind the scenes. Next, we catalog the assets and the liabilities. There's a rhythm to it, a ledger's heartbeat. Cash flow here, receivables there, the equity in the trucks and in the buildings. Marcus and I sat through hours of statements, bank visits, account meetings. We traced payments back through layers of transactions, lawyers' trusts, nominee accounts. When you spend a life building something, you learn where the doors are hidden. That knowledge worked for me now. It was the kind of advantage you only ever truly appreciate when you're trying to close a door quietly before someone else realizes you went through it. I remember sitting at my desk in the late afternoons when the light slanted through the office blinds and turned the dust particles into a kind of slow, respectable snowfall. Lorraine would come by with a stack of payroll, her face composed like a woman who balances too many things at once. Keith would pop in to talk over route optimization, the easy way he drifted into my space like a man who assumed he'd always be welcome. I listened to them. I smiled when it was required. I answered questions. I debated decisions. I acted as if the only thing amiss was the housekeeping of growing pains. Inside, I was arranging an exit like a mechanic reorders his tools, methodically, with the least fuss possible. People imagine revenge as fireworks. They picture shouting on front steps, slamming doors, headlines that go viral. That's not how I wanted to go. I wanted something quieter. To leave with my dignity intact, Not because they begged me to stay, but because I chose a life that did not depend on the approval of people who had shown themselves unworthy. I wanted to make sure the company did not bleed because of their selfishness, and that whatever I left behind would not be stolen quietly after my back was turned. So I began to liquidate strategically, not as a man fleeing, but as one reallocating resources into something I could call mine. We sold off assets that weren't essential to core operations. We consolidated accounts. Marcus set up a trust with provisions for contingencies, for my retirement, for a seed to plant somewhere else. I did it all with the same hand I used to hand over keys. Deliberate, steady, and without drama. The transfers were legal, careful, documented. I wanted there to be nothing for them to accuse me of later. I wanted my conscience clear. When I signed the transfer papers, my pen felt heavy in my hand. I thought of the many mornings I'd risen before dawn to see the trucks out on the road, the nights I'd stayed up until numbers balanced, the times I'd refused pay when my crew needed a bonus. I thought of Lorraine laughing at some joke in the break room, of Keith leaning against my truck like a brother. It was a strange grief to move money away from a thing you built to protect yourself from the people who turned it into a weapon. In the meantime, I kept the world believing I was oblivious. They liked that narrative. The old man, too, said in his routines to notice a little reshuffling. The boss, too, trusting to read between the lines. Lorraine and Keith never once suspected the quietness of my exit. They thought I was being gullible or forgiving or simply tired. If there's cruelty in this, it is that they were comfortable assuming I'd remain so. There were small moments I could have used to reveal the truth. A bank clerk who offered conspiratorial wink. A lawyer who suggested showing them the ledger and watching the show unfold. But spectacle is a currency I've never valued. I chose instead to move with the dignity my father taught me. Don't make noise for the sake of being heard. If you have to leave, leave like you always worked, with your back straight and your hands clean. People ask later why I didn't tell my son, why I didn't drag the family into the mess. But what would that have done? It would have taught him to value spectacle over substance. It would have tied him up in anger while the work of rebuilding went undone. I wanted him to know how to stand steady when things went wrong. I wanted him to see that sometimes stepping away is strength, not surrender. There were practicalities, too. Liquidation must be done in sequence. You don't tip the whole ship at once. You move funds into safe havens. You pay taxes. You document transfers, so that later there's no whisper of impropriety. Marcus and the accountant handled the language of it, the forms, the clauses, the approvals. I handled the decisions. Each time I signed, a small weight left my chest. I felt the space in my life rearrange itself into something less crowded with betrayal and more hospitable to quiet things. An early morning coffee by a river, a small repair shop to teach hands to trade again, a porch where a man can listen to the wind without being judged. If anyone asks, I can say I left because the business needed different leadership for modern times. And that would be true in a sense. Darius left for college and came back with new tools. Companies need new ideas to survive. But that's not the whole truth. The whole truth includes the small betrayals inked in ledgers and hotel receipts. It includes the way intimacy can be traded quietly for convenience. The whole truth includes a man deciding that the cost of staying was more than he could bear. In those weeks, I moved my life with the same patience I'd used to build it. I sold a few trucks honestly, found trusted buyers among old drivers who wanted to retire with dignity. I signed paperwork to ensure pensions were secure for people who had never asked for anything but steady work. I arranged things so that when I walked out the door for the last time, I could do it with my hands empty and my conscience intact. I did not want my leaving to look like a punishment. I wanted it to look like an answer, quiet, final, and wholly mine. All the while, they went about their days under the same sun. Lorraine still brewed coffee at the same time every morning. Keith still told the same jokes in the yard. They thought I was the same man I had always been. They were comfortable with that illusion. They didn't know that the man smiling at them had already packed a small suitcase and mapped out a life that stood apart from their greed. There's a satisfaction in careful work, even in work that means walking away. You take the parts you built and you rearrange them into a shelter that protects you from the weather of other people's choices. I found myself thinking of the bench in my father's backyard that he'd restored after a storm. New screws, sanded wood, oil to make it shine. He'd said, "You mend what you can, and you leave the rest of the weather." I felt like a man who had mended enough to sit in the sun again. When the day came to sign the final papers that made the exit official, I did it in the quiet of my lawyer's office. There was no fanfare. Marcus slid the documents across the desk, and we both signed. I felt the slow unclenching of something that had held me taut for months. It wasn't an end so much as an opening. Lorraine and Keith would find out, of course. People always do. But for now, the knowledge belonged to me, and that felt like a bomb. I walked out of the company that afternoon like a man who had closed a book he had written himself. The drivers waved. The dispatcher smiled. Keith clapped me on the back as if our bond had not been severed by paper and bed. Lorraine asked, with the same soft concern she always had, whether I was all right. I smiled and said I was. It was true in that moment. I had made my plan. I had my papers in order. I had a small place to go, a new shop to open if I wanted, a river to sit by if I didn't. The house behind me hummed with the ghosts of our years together, but my feet were already finding a different road. I don't know what they will call my leaving. Some will call it cowardice. Others will call it wise. I don't much care what the world names it. I only know what I felt under my palms when the final page signed. A calmness, like a man who has decided to stop pouring water into a cup with a hole in the bottom. The plan was in motion. The exit had a name. And as I drove away, I felt, for the first time in a long while, the possibility that a quiet life rebuilt might be better than a loud life betrayed. The morning I decided to leave, the office smelled like old paper and diesel, and the kind of coffee that's been reheated too many times. It felt like the right smell for what I was about to do, honest and familiar and a little tired. I had slept poorly, not because I was worried about the next step, but because a part of me had been wound tight for months. When I woke, I made coffee slowly, the kettle hissing like a small permission, and walked through the house with the same steady hands I used to wash a truck's headlights. I dressed in the shirt I always wore for the important but ordinary things, clean but not new. There was no need for theatrics. At 9, I called a meeting. I asked for the boardroom rather than the office with the view. The boardroom felt less like a throne and more like a table where work gets done, and that's how I wanted this moment to be remembered. Not as a courtroom drama, but as a business decision and a personal answer. Lorraine and Keith arrived separately. Keith strolled in with that easy grin that had always made everyone relax. Lorraine's smile was smaller, guarded in a way that told me she knew something I had not yet said. The others sat around the table, the accountant, the operations manager, 2 drivers who'd been with us since the first truck, all faces I'd learned to read over the years. I put the company documents on the table, neat stacks in manila folders. The deeds, the ledgers, the insurance papers, the insurance numbers that used to feel like my name. I could sense the confusion ripple a little, a small intake of breath here, a shift of weight there. I waited until the small noise of office life settled, like waiting for a radio to find a station, and then I spoke. "You both win," I said. It was a plain sentence. It was the truth, and it was the simplest way to close the chapter, without dressing it up. There was no flourish in those words. They were not a surrender, and they were not a confession. They were a clear set-down of expectations. Keith's smile thinned. Lorraine gave that small laugh that is neither a yes nor a no. I slid the folders across the table with my hand flat, the way my father used to slide a tool to me when I was learning a job. Steady and deliberate. The folders hit the wood with a surety that felt good. This was not a robbery. It was not a stolen moment. It was a transfer. Papers flowed the way money had flowed, but this time I was deciding where the current would go. "Henry," Keith began, the polite tone that wants to keep everything smooth even when the floor is sliding out from under the room. "Are you sure? We can—" "I'm sure," I said. I saw him look at Lorraine for a reaction. She didn't give one. Her hands were folded on the table like someone who keeps things together with small, precise movements. There was no argument. There was no rising voice, no slam of a fist, just a gentle, thin sound of breath that happens when something monumental has been made small enough to be carried. When I stood, it felt odd at first, like leaving a stage after the lights have dimmed. I held my chair for a moment and then set it back, walked to the door, and opened it. The hallway smelled warm, the same scent of paper and oil and human rhythm. As I stepped out, I felt a small, surprising lightness. The expectation that had been weighing down my days, the unspoken ledger of how a husband should be, how a friend should be, how a boss should be, it was no longer clinging to me. I did not fling it off like a jacket. I simply left it folded on the table where it belonged. The drive out of town was slow. I didn't take the highway. I pulled the old Tulane road that runs past cotton fields and the shrines to small towns, the places where time keeps its edges soft. I watched the land unspool itself. Barns leaning into their work, dogs that knew the sound of a neighbor's truck, a sky that kept showing me the same pale blue I'd seen in 1,000 dawns. It was an ordinary day in a life that had once felt too crowded with noise. I had traded that crowd for the clear sound of my own breath. I rented a small house in a town that hugged the coast like it was protecting a secret. It had a porch with paint flaking where the swing had once hung, and a small kitchen that looked onto a street where old men tipped their hats to passing cars. The house was modest, the kind where the floors creak in a way that makes you listen, and that was the sort of music I had been craving. I moved in with a few things: a toolbox, a worn leather chair that had belonged to my father, a box of papers I could not bring myself to throw away, and a half-dozen mugs that had been chipped from years of use. I brought the watch Lorraine had given me the year the company hit 100 trucks. That watch kept time the way a true thing does, quiet, relentless, and honest. My first morning in that house, I woke without an alarm. That one small thing felt like a small revolution. For years my life had responded to whistles and dispatch calls and the brittle ring of a scheduler. I had been teaching my body to stand at attention for other people's needs. Now, for the first time in decades, I rose because my body decided it was time. I made coffee, the kettle singing with the same steady patience as before, but it felt different. Not a fuel for endurance, but a small ritual for a life I was curating now. I walked down to the harbor in the afternoons. The sea is honest. It gives you what it has and takes what it must without explanation. The fishermen nodded to me like men who know how to live by the weather, and I nodded back because there's dignity in knowing nothing fancy. I found a little repair shop by the highway, a place with an old sign and new floors, and I started to talk with the owner about fixing up a corner, teaching a few boys how to change oil, how to read a spark plug, how to treat a customer with the kind of respect that hadn't always been in the company I'd left. There was no master plan in the way I set it up. It was a small apprenticeship sprung from a man who had built hands into tools and wanted to pass that on. At first, people in town treated me with a kind of curious caution. They had likely heard a version of my leaving. Small towns are full of versions. But when I came into the cafe and ordered coffee, the barista learned my name. When I bought nuts from the corner market, the owner wrapped them with a careful hand. It was the ordinary kindness of being small in a new place, the kind of acceptance that doesn't need explanation. That suited me just fine. A few times, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a name on the caller ID I recognized, an old dispatcher, a man from the yard, a driver checking on a shipment. I let it go to voicemail. There's a peculiar peace in letting the world reach for you and decide you are not available. It was not spite. It was not punishment. It was a boundary I had not allowed myself to build before, because I thought my value was a bridge that held everyone up. It turns out a man can be valuable without being everyone's bridge. I spent afternoons sitting at the pier, watching the water move in the slow, uncompromising way the tide moves. Sometimes I took my toolbox and tinkered on small engines that washed up in the minds of fishermen. Small motors, outboard props, the things that make a life at sea possible. I found a rhythm again, not the furious expansion of a company, but the careful tending of a craft. A boy named Jonah started coming by the shop. He's a quiet kid with calluses on his hands and a focus like a man twice his age. He asked questions and listened. I taught him to change a plug, to listen to a motor the way we used to listen to each other before the betrayals taught us to be careful with words. There were nights I thought about Lorraine and Keith. I did not rehearse what I might have said. I had said what needed to be said. There was no satisfaction in imagining them scowling or sorry. If a door ever opened between us later, it would be because something true had changed inside their chests, not because I had made noise about it. I had spent too many years tending other people's expectations. It was time to tend the quiet orchard of my own. People ask, sometimes, how it felt to walk away. They expect grand language, liberation, ruin, triumph. The reality was smaller and truer. It felt like taking a breath that had been waiting a long time to be inhaled. It felt like standing up from a chair you'd sat in for decades and discovering that your legs still worked the way they used to. There was grief, yes, grief for the years that had been hollowed out by unspoken things. But there was also this new thing, room to make mornings that were mine, room to teach a boy how to be useful in the world, room to sit on a porch and let the sky do its slow, honest work. On quiet evenings, I walked ashore and thought of the trucks I'd once owned, of routes mapped like veins across states, of laughter in the yard at 3 a.m. when we'd been too tired to be clever. Those memories are mine. They are neither stolen nor diminished by the choices of others. I carried them like lanterns, not torches. They gave me light to find the path the rest of my life might take. There were practicalities to settle. The trust I'd arranged, the pensions I'd secured for drivers who'd been with me through rain and snow, the legal papers Marcus had kept like a steady hand on my shoulder. I had not left people without care. There's a way to move away from something and still make sure the people who depended on it are not hurt by your decision. That was part of how I wanted to leave, with dignity for us all, even when some of us had not been dignified. One evening, a woman from the town knocked on my door. She brought a pie warm from the oven and told me she'd heard there was a new man in town who knew how to fix things. We talked for a long while about small things, the way the sun hit certain roofs, the best bait for the crabs, where to get the newspaper that still smells like ink. For the first time in a long while, my life wasn't defined by ledger lines and schedules. It was defined by the small, human interactions that make a life livable. The day I walked away was not the end of me. It was a turning point where a man decides to stop pouring his life into a well that no longer holds water. I had given myself the permission to be less busy and more present. I had left certainty behind in exchange for possibility. The next mornings arrived with no alarms and with the soft music of neighbors starting their days. I learned again how to read the weather, how to fix a motor with my eyes and hands, how to sit by a window and think without the pressure of being useful to someone else. I have not forgotten what I built. I carry it like a scar that reminds me to be careful with trust. But I also carry new things. A boy who calls me granddad sometimes, a little shop where an old man can teach hands to be honest, a small rented house with a porch where the light looks different every hour. I left without fireworks. I left with a bundle of careful plans and a heart that had decided to beat at a different pace. I left with the knowledge that sometimes the most radical act of revenge is not to make them suffer, but to make yourself well again. The garage hums the way a living thing hums, steady, familiar, awake. Mornings here start with the same small rituals I learned long ago. Sweep the floor, take the rag from the hook, make coffee that's better than the stuff we used to choke down at the office. I like the simplicity of it. There's a satisfaction to being useful in a way that's immediate. An engine coughs, I listen. A boat rounds, I replace it. The work is honest. It answers back when you do it right. The harbor has a different rhythm than a boardroom. The tide sets the clock, and the men I work for tell the weather better than any app. They bring in motors with stories. A net caught on a prop, a winter or too much salt, a boy learning to steer for the first time. I listen to those stories like a man who's learning to hold life in smaller pieces. It's quieter than the life I left. It's kinder, too. One morning, while I was tightening a carburetor and humming along to the radio, the postman walked up with a thin envelope in his hand. He knew me enough now to drop it on the bench rather than call out. Papers have a way of changing the temperature of a room. You can feel a shift when someone folds good news or bad into white. The envelope had that official look, a name and an address, and the kind of serif font lawyers use to make everything feel heavier than it is. I set the wrench down, wiped my hand on the rag, and opened it. It was a legal notice. Keith's name was in the text, so it was a company that used to be mine. It spoke of mismanagement, unpaid debts, lawsuits piling up like winter storms, and creditors calling like gulls. I read it once, then again, because there's always a human habit to measure betrayal the way you measure screws. Count them, check the length, see if any are missing. The words didn't sting the way they might have before. Instead, they landed like a fact you record in your book and move on from. When I folded the letter, I did it with the same care I'd fold a shirt to put away. It was an action that felt deliberate, not dismissive. I set it aside on the workbench, under the old coffee tin to hold spare nuts and washers. It could have been a trap, an invitation to rage, a reason to squander peace on petty triumphs. I had been given many reasons for fury over the years. I considered them, and I'd learned something better. Fury burns a hand that hold it. I did not want burnt hands. A kid named Jonah stopped by that afternoon, carrying a motor he'd been trying to coax back to life. He's a good kid, curious and stubborn the right way. He watched me open the motor the way someone watches a favorite book, flipping pages with care. "You hear that?" I asked, handing him a small spanner. "Listen." He listened, and then turned the propeller with his palm, grinning when the rhythm answered him back. Teaching him was a way to put the letter in its place. When you show a young man how to fix a part that's been broken, you're doing more than repairing metal. You're passing on a steadiness that won't be found in courtrooms or columns of figures. News of the company's collapse spread the way news does in small towns and through the grapevine of former business contacts. I heard pieces. A truck repossessed here, an unpaid invoice there, an old driver worrying about his pension. I felt a small tug, not jealousy, not triumph, more like a recognition that consequences tend to follow the path laid by shortcuts. I thought of the drivers who trusted us, and I made some calls. I checked on folks I could help quietly. There was a line to be drawn. I wasn't going to fix other people's wrongs for them, but I also couldn't stand aside when I had the power to make a small difference. It's how I'd always tried to be, even when the rules of the game bent toward profit. That evening I sat on the porch with the watch Lorraine had given me years ago ticking against my wrist. The porch light painted the rail a soft yellow. The harbor was a black sheet with a few lights like stars stuck where they shouldn't be. Boats creaked. Dogs barked in the distance. There was a comfort in the world continuing its course without asking my permission. I folded my hands and watched the sky take on the last cop of the day. Memories come easy at dusk. I thought about the early years, loading the truck at dawn, trying to teach a man how to read a waybill, Lorraine counting the receipts by lamplight. There was a time when all that felt like progress. I remember the day I bought the second truck, the license plate number, the smell of new rubber. It felt like we were building something that would outlast us. I took pride in that, but pride can be a tricky thing. It can make you forget to look after the life that sits beside the work. I learned the hard way that loyalty in business needs to be mirrored by integrity in the people you keep close. People sometimes ask me if I feel cheated. I suppose there are days when I feel like the map of my life was redrawn without my signature. But the map is a paper thing. The landscape is what matters. I have found that landscape here. The boy who helps pluck a stubborn bolt, the neighbor who brings a loaf of bread, the fisherman who tips his hat and says, "Good to see you, Henry." Those small courtesies are the currency of a life that feels whole. One afternoon, as I was teaching Jonah how to solder a wire, a car pulled up and Lorraine stepped out. She's not the same woman who kept our ledgers like a sacred thing, and neither am I the same man who believed a job could be the sum of the soul. She looked at the garage like someone seeing a map of a life she hadn't expected to revisit. We stood there, two people who had once been married in a church whose bell still rings on Sundays, and there was an hour where silence did more than speeches ever could. She didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't offer one. There were no recriminations on my side, no pleading on hers. She nodded once, then turned and walked back to her car. Later that week, a neighbor stopped by with news that Keith had filed for bankruptcy protection and that creditors were already knocking. I put the letter back on the bench for a moment, then carried it to the small filing box where I keep things I might someday need to remember. The paper will live there, a record of a storm I've weathered. But the thing that mattered was not the collapse itself. It was a quiet fact that in walking away, I had not lost what I wanted most, A life I could look at without shame. There are people who find their revenge in headlines, in the collapse of those who wronged them. I have seen that kind of satisfaction, a loud clap in an empty room. It never looked like peace. Peace is quieter. Peace means waking up and not having to tilt your face to the grindstone. Peace means being available for the small, ordinary things that make days worth living. It means teaching a boy not because you need to prove yourself, but because you want to pass on a skill that will steady his hands and his heart. Some evenings, the kids from the harbor come by, and we set up an old radio and listen to some music that smells like memory. We laugh at jokes that smell like salt. Jonah sometimes calls me Granddad, not because of a bloodline, but because a title is a smaller thing than the giving of time. I like that name. It fits me better than Boss, which tastes like metal in meetings. Granddad tastes like a well-worn sweater and a pot of coffee. I don't keep track of time in a way I once did, with ledgers and quarterly reports. My watch still ticks, of course, and there is a kind of comfort in those steady ticks. But I mark the passing of life by moments. The first time Jonah fixed a motor without my help, the day the neighbor's boy stopped by to ask about wiring, the slow return of my laugh when a story lands. Those are the measures of richness now. When the sun drops low and the harbor goes soft, I sit on the porch and watch the light take the edge off the world. Once, I thought revenge would feel like a victory. Now I see that the true victory was my choosing what to value. They took a company. They took years that I had poured into work that no longer returned me. They took a wife who found a different path. But they did not take my hands or the way they remember how to steady a motor, how to listen, or how to let the tide tell me the time. So when the legal letters come, I fold them carefully and set them aside. I let the sea do the rest. I keep fixing engines, teaching boys how to pay attention to small things, and waking up without an alarm. At night, when the sky is a bruise of purple and orange, I whisper to the dark like a benediction. They took my company, my wife, and my years. But they never took my peace. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. Sometimes one quiet comment is enough to say you were here. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is where you are. One word is enough to say you listened.